Our story begins not in a palace or a royal court, but in the cramped, ledger-filled room of a weaver's shop in the small German city of Augsburg. It was here, in the mid-14th century, that a man named Hans Fugger arrived as a humble textile merchant. He could never have imagined that within 2 generations, his name would be whispered in the corridors of power, with more reverence and fear than that of kings. This is the story of the Fugger dynasty, a family that invented modern finance, crowned emperors, challenged the Vatican, and built a fortune so vast it makes today's billionaires look like paupers. They were the forgotten kings of Europe, and their empire was built not on land, but on debt. Hans Fugger's son, Jakob the Elder, laid the groundwork, but it was his grandson, Jakob Fugger, known to history as Jacob the Rich, who would become the architect of a financial revolution. Born in 1459, Jacob was a man of singular vision and ruthless calculation. He understood a fundamental truth that others did not. In an age of rising costs and constant war, cash was more powerful than titles. Monarchs were perpetually broke, and their need was his opportunity. Jacob's first major breakthrough came not from lending, but from a physical asset, metals. Through a combination of shrewd negotiation and sheer boldness, the Fuggers gained a dominant stake in the silver and copper mines of Tyrol, Hungary, and Saxony. This wasn't just a business, it was a strategic masterstroke. Silver was the lifeblood of European coinage, and copper was essential for casting cannons. The Fuggers didn't just trade these metals, they controlled their production, creating the world's first vertically integrated mining monopoly. They owned the mines, smelted the ore, transported the metal, and minted the coins. This gave them a stable and enormous source of capital, a river of silver that would fuel their ascent to unparalleled power. The true test of Fugger power came with the Holy Roman Empire's imperial election of 1519. The throne was vacant, and the 2 leading candidates were Francis I of France and Charles III of Spain, the grandson of the deceased emperor. Charles was the preferred candidate for the Fuggers, as they had existing ties to his Habsburg family, but he was deeply in debt. The election was not decided by bloodline or divine right, but by cold, hard cash. The 7 prince electors of Germany were notoriously corrupt and open to the highest bidder. Francis I, with the full treasury of France behind him, offered massive bribes. Charles needed to match and exceed them, but his coffers were empty. He turned to one man, Jacob Fugger. Without hesitation, Jacob opened his vaults. He funneled over 500,000 florins, a sum exceeding the annual revenue of entire kingdoms, to the electors. This was not a gift. It was a calculated loan with immense political interest. When the votes were cast, Charles III of Spain became Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor. The most powerful title in Europe had been purchased, and the Fuggers held the deed. They had effectively crowned an emperor, and in doing so, they made the Habsburgs their permanent clients. The debt Charles owed was so colossal that he would spend his entire reign borrowing more from the Fuggers just to pay the interest on his original debt to them. The Fuggers had become the bankers to an empire upon which the sun never set. To manage this sprawling financial empire, Jacob Fugger needed information. He created the world's first true news service, a network of couriers and agents that stretched from the silver mines of Hungary to the spice docks of Lisbon and the papal court in Rome. His agents reported on everything: political intrigues, potential wars, harvest yields, and ship movements. A Fugger courier could often travel between cities faster than a king's messenger. This intelligence apparatus gave Jacob an insurmountable advantage. He knew about events before his competitors, and more importantly, before his royal debtors. He could call in loans ahead of a crisis, or shift funds to avoid a loss. This system was the 16th century equivalent of a Bloomberg terminal, and it made the Fugger Bank the most sophisticated and feared institution in the world. Their headquarters in Augsburg, the Fugger House, became a nerve center of global finance, where deals were struck that could start or stop wars. But the Fuggers' ambition was not confined to the earthly realm. They set their sights on the church itself. For centuries, the Catholic Church had condemned the charging of interest, known as usury, as a sin. This posed a significant problem for a family whose entire business was based on lending money. The Fuggers, in collaboration with the Pope, found an ingenious and controversial loophole. They became the primary bankers for the sale of indulgences. An indulgence was a papal pardon that reduced the amount of time a soul had to spend in purgatory. The church, always in need of funds for grand projects like the new St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, began aggressively selling these spiritual get-out-of-jail-free cards. The Fuggers managed the entire operation. They advanced large sums of money to the Pope up front, and then their agents would travel with the papal pardoners, taking a direct cut of the proceeds from the sale to the faithful. This system turned salvation into a financial transaction, and the Fuggers were the brokers. It was a public relations nation's disaster in the making. A German monk and professor of theology named Martin Luther was outraged by this blatant commercialization of faith. In 1517, he nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, and one of his primary targets was the unholy alliance between the Pope and the Fugger Bank. The Protestant Reformation, one of the most transformative movements in Western history, was funded, in part, by the very institution it sought to condemn. At the height of their power, the Fuggers were unimaginably wealthy. Jacob the Rich's personal fortune was estimated at nearly 2% of the entire European GDP. To put that in perspective, it would be like a single individual today controlling over $2 trillion. He used this wealth to transform his hometown of Augsburg. He built the Fuggerei in 1521, the world's oldest social housing complex still in use today. It was a self-contained neighborhood with its own walls and gates, offering apartments for a nominal rent of 1 Rhenish guilder per year, with the condition that tenants pray for the Fugger family. It was an act of both profound charity and calculated legacy building, a permanent monument to the family's piety and power. He also commissioned stunning works of art, patronized Albrecht Dürer, and lived in a palatial residence that rivaled those of the nobility he bankrolled. However, the very source of the Fuggers' power, their deep entanglement with the Habsburg monarchy, would also be the cause of their downfall. The empire of Charles V was a sprawling, unwieldy entity constantly at war. He fought the French in Italy, the Ottoman Turks in the Mediterranean, and Protestant princes within Germany. War was, and remains, catastrophically expensive. The Fuggers became the Habsburgs' perpetual ATM, lending ever larger sums to fund these endless conflicts. The problem was that the loans were becoming riskier and the collateral less reliable. The Spanish crown, a key part of the Habsburg domains, promised the Fugger repayment from the silver shipments arriving from their new colonies in the Americas. But these fleets were unreliable, often delayed by storms, pirates, or rival powers. The Fugger Empire was becoming a giant, precarious pyramid of credit, with its foundation resting on the unstable bedrock of royal promises. The first major crack appeared in 1557. King Philip II of Spain, the son of Charles V, found his treasury drained by decades of war. Faced with debts he simply could not repay, he did what monarchs often do when they owe too much to powerful bankers. He declared sovereign default. He unilaterally suspended all payments to his creditors. For the Fuggers, this was a catastrophic blow. A vast portion of their assets were frozen, instantly turning liquid wealth into worthless paper. They were suddenly, desperately illiquid. They scrambled to call in their own loans and sell assets, but the shockwave was too great. The Spanish crown defaulted again in 1575 and 1607, each time driving another nail into the Fugger financial coffin. The river of silver from the New World that was supposed to save them had instead washed away the very foundation of their credit. The final blow was a combination of internal complacency and external shift. Anton Fugger, Jacob's nephew, and a brilliant financier in his own right, managed to stave off total collapse for a time through sheer financial genius. But the family's subsequent generations lacked the ruthless, entrepreneurial spirit of Jacob the Rich. They began to act more like conservative aristocrats than daring merchants, preferring to invest in land and titles rather than risky, high-reward ventures. Meanwhile, the center of global finance was shifting. With the discovery of the Americas and new sea routes to Asia, the economic heart of Europe was moving from the German interior to the Atlantic ports of Antwerp, Amsterdam, and London. The Fuggers, tied to their landlocked base in Augsburg and their toxic relationship with the Habsburgs, were left behind. Their sophisticated banking techniques were adopted and improved upon by others in these new hubs of commerce. By the mid-17th century, the House of Fugger was a shadow of its former self. The financial kings of Europe were now mere nobles, their vast fortune dissipated, their power a memory. The Fuggers invented modern finance, proving private wealth could rival nations. Their epic rise and fall remains a timeless warning that the debt which builds empires can also destroy them.